So hello everyone. Um, Very nice to have you here. It's a little bit unexpected that you hear us today in English because this means me, Thomas Lörs, Dimitri Nabokov, and Markus Bölking, we have special guests here, and they're from Canada, I think.
It's correct, Montreal.
Okay, and just give a brief about them. We have Martin Sauerbrei here, who is a researcher at Graz in Europe. And we have here Oksana Shevel, who is an associate professor of comparative politics at Department of Political Science at Tufts University. I hope I got this right.
Yep,
And
tough. Yep.
hello, and Maria Popova is also associate professor of political science at McGill University in, can you say it?
Montreal.
Montreal.
Montreal, Canada. Yeah, Oksana is from Boston, US.
Okay, nice to have you here. And today we want to talk about Russia, maybe also Ukraine, about the future of these countries, what's happening there. Yeah, who want to start? Martin, you want to give us a brief?
I will start. So the main
Thank you.
point today will be Professors Popova and Chevel also wrote a really great book about the history of Russia and Ukraine since 1991. And in this book, you're tracing the different histories of Ukraine and Russia and where they went different ways and where they made different decisions or just circumstances pushed them in different directions. And you argue in your book that the conflict, the war we see today is somehow, not say logical, but somehow a consequence of those how do you say? I'm sorry, of those
Different paths, maybe.
of the different paths and of
Divergence.
different histories of the divergence of those two countries. So where do these differences start? Where does the different genesis or where are the main problems for Ukraine and Russia? Where do they start to develop, or does this gap between Ukraine and Russia starts to broaden? Why?
Maria, do you want to start?
Yeah, so in the book, we pinpoint really the very late Soviet
Oh
period,
no.
the way in which the Soviet Union disintegrated as
Did you
the
lose connection?
source of what is a misalignment in the understanding of Russia and Ukraine, of what the collapse of the Soviet Union meant. So on the one hand, um, the Ukrainian president at the time, Kravchuk, famously noted that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a civilized divorce. But as we tried to show in the book, on Russia's part, Russian elites broadly understood the disintegration of the Soviet Union more as not the ultimate end of common statehood, but some sort of an opportunity to reinvent it, a rewriting of the vows, if we want to keep the metaphor of marriage in there, and this misaligned understanding of 1991 puts Ukraine and Russia on two different paths. And Ukraine is perceiving itself as being on an independent statehood path. And over time, it increasingly commits to this independent statehood. And Russia, on the other hand, in almost immediately thinks that there is a need to somehow tie the former Soviet space back together to itself in some way, and specifically in Ukraine's case, pursues policies trying to bring Ukraine back, so to speak. And this triggers what we call an escalatory cycle between these two different two different commitments. And it's escalatory because the more Ukraine commits to this independent statehood that they have, the more Russia intensifies its efforts to re-imperialize. And the more Russia intensifies efforts to re-imperialize, the more Ukraine commits to independence. So that leads gradually, this escalation gradually leads to growing divergence between Russia and Ukraine, the two countries evolving in very different directions. And in the book, we have a few examples where we think that the divergence, a few points where the divergence could have been bridged one way or another. So it's not an argument that once 91 happens, it's somehow predetermined that this collision course would happen. And we go through the various processes and the various dimensions of divergence.
May I ask a question? Is 1991 the starting point for all the developments we see and that you describe in your book? Or do you refer and focus even on early events in history that may already maybe show some fractions between Ukrainian and Russian societies?
We do go, maybe I'll take this question. We do go into history, but the way we treat a historical process in the book. So first of all, to highlight that this kind of push and pull, in other words, whenever there was a Ukrainian desire for greater separation from Russia, right? And again, it took, of course, very different shapes in different historical time periods. There was resistance from Russian imperial center, Soviet center. So that's sort of like a constant. But what really matters for our story is how history is told in the post-1991 period, right? In other words, how this history of Ukrainian-Russian relations going back to the Kievan Rus is told. And here sort of the divergence becomes important because in Russia, essentially the same narrative that existed in the Soviet period and before that in the Tsarist period more or less remained the official policy. So this notion that Ukrainians and Russians were always destined to be together, and whenever they were sort of separate, it was either Western meddling, be it Austrian, Polish, more recently, of course, NATO, or it was some sort of traitors who were behind this agenda of separating Ukraine from Russia, like Mazepa, right? If we go back to 1700s, or the Petlura in the beginning of the 20th century, and then Ukrainian nationalists in the during and after the Second World War. So this sort of Russian narrative, historical narrative of existential unity remained, and of course Putin is fully committed to it. But what was happening in Ukraine, and this is one of the divergence elements that we talk about, is divergence on identity politics, and historical memory is part of this identity politics, is that elites who were ruling independent Ukrainian state were interested, some of them kind of uncovering this previously hidden history of, say, Ukrainian resistance in the 20th century and before. And others may not have been particularly animated by historical details, but they broadly agreed that, Ukrainian nation is a separate nation, and we need to have a history for Ukrainian nation that would underscore its separateness from Russia, right? So in other words, historical past could be narrated in two different ways. It could be narrated as there was always this unity between Ukrainians and Russians, or it could be narrated that, there were more complicated relationships, and whenever Ukraine tried to separate, Russia resisted that and aggressively tried to prevent that. And this is sort of where the divergence takes place, because already in the 1990s, Ukrainians, for example, begin to reassess the famine of the 1930s. That was not just a class policy; it was explicitly anti-Ukrainian policy. Great resistance from the Russian political class over that. They continue to define it as "quote unquote" a common tragedy of the Soviet people. So again, kind of the people are together as opposed to separate. Other aspects of this divergence would be on language policy. Again, Ukraine introduces Ukrainian as the only state language as a symbolic kind of marker of separate statehood. So on all of these things, like citizenship policy that we also go over in the book, when Ukraine insisted on having single citizenship and Russia wanted to have dual citizenship with Ukraine or common CIS citizenship. And of course, this narration of history is part of it. So in other words, to your question, so yes, history matters, but in the story that we tell in the book, it's how history told is what matters, as opposed to sort of finding some consensus with how to interpret particular event. It's what narrative do you tell? Is your historical narrative that the two nations, the two people are destined to be together going back to Slavic tribes, or is the story that there was a distinct Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian political project, and that project historically has been crushed by Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and now contemporary Russia.
So do you think that Russia had this one narrative that's more or less basically going on through all those 30 years, and it gets stronger with Putin, I think so. So this imperialist agenda comes more and more with Putin. But of course, it was prevalent in the Allies under Yeltsin. But in the Ukrainian understanding of Ukraine itself, there were some points in the last 30 years where Ukrainians tried to find their way and where they could decide to be more Russian or more Ukrainian until it broke down with Maidan, more or less, under Russian pressure. So that was the point where Russia decided to interfere for real, I think. Would you agree?
Well, the story maybe, and then Maria can talk about Maidan, and because we do talk about these turning points when the divergence could have been breached, and Maidan is certainly one of them. But in fact, Orange Revolution is an earlier turning point. Exactly.
I think Yanukovych presidentship was a turning point, because if Maidan wouldn't have happened, maybe Ukraine would have gone more in a Russian direction, or would have adopted the Russian narrative more or less. So it was really
right. But let me just before we get to the turning points, let me just address this. As you said, that Ukrainians maybe felt kind of more in favor of pro-Russian narrative and so forth. I think the story of popular attitudes in Ukraine is really is interesting, and in some sense quite different from the story of elite dynamics, because on the elite side, already in the very, very early post-Soviet period, or maybe even back in the last year of the Soviet period, there is this commitment to distinct statehood for the Ukrainian nationalists and the National Democratic Center-right. That's more ideological commitment. This is the Ruch. These are people who went to gulags, who are committed to Ukrainian state independence ideologically, who are animated by all these questions about language and history and so forth. But then we have these former communists, part of which essentially jumps ship, for lack of a better word, once it becomes clear that the power of Moscow is waning. They want to maintain position of power in Ukraine. And they form this, what Andrew Wilson called a grand bargain, kind of this informal grand bargain between the center-right and this reformed, or turncoat, if you want to be very cynical, communists, who support all of these policies, right? Kind of underscoring Ukrainian state distinctiveness, pursuing policies, strengthening state sovereignty, because they want to rule that state, right? And that state has to be sufficiently distinct. Having distinct national history gives it more legitimacy. And the public is more divided. So we do have, what we emphasize in the book, that the public opinion, public attitudes were really changing and kind of malleable and not really set in stone. And there was pull and push. We have, for example, Ukrainian public voting overwhelmingly for independence declaration in 91, but then economic crisis hits, kind of this notion that maybe in some sort of union with Russia, economic conditions will improve. Of course, there is regional divide. But there are all of these processes going on, and public opinion slowly is changing, first very gradually, and it especially takes place in the geographic center of Ukraine more so than in the east and the south. Kind of the center becomes more like the west. So all of this pushing in the direction, very slowly, admittedly, and gradually, but not in the direction that Russia wants. So people essentially come to kind of think of themselves as Ukrainian, accept even the policy of, say, Ukrainian as only state language, even though they may continue to speak Russian, but the symbolism of this policy is becoming more acceptable. And then, of course, these critical junctions happen, the first of which is the Orange Revolution, that maybe Maria can talk about that.
Yeah, and the Orange Revolution in our story is really a critical juncture because it's highly contingent. It could have turned out differently. The two sides, the side committed to the Ukrainianization policies, to Western orientation, this distinctive Ukrainian identity, and also European aspirations, is kind of evenly matched to the pro-Russian unity with Russia type of identity conception. And really, in this even match in 2004, obviously there was a lot of there was the stolen elections, the distinctive identity pro-European integration part was supposed to win, but if let's say Yushchenko had died from the poisoning, Yanukovych may have been installed as or may have become the president in this election, and at that point he would have hit the ground running with both autocratization attempt, which, as we know from his later presidency, he was prone to, and with sort of pushing Ukraine towards the pro-Russian identity conception and orientate regime type orientation. So if that had happened back in 2004-5, this is when this growing divergence that we observe may have been basically stopped, may have been reversed by a Yanukovych administration more effectively than he could do it 10 years later, right? So, or almost 10 years later. So that's why the Orange Revolution is a really important critical juncture, both for the development of a distinctive Ukrainian identity, the increase in commitment to that identity within Ukraine, and also a major regime divergence turning point, because after the revolution wins, we have a precedent in Ukraine for the Ukrainian electorate that elections are not going to be manipulated. It just would not work. So that's an important step for Ukraine's democratic development.
Yeah, I remember one protest at Maidan said in an interview that we went to the Orange Revolution, we thought Yushchenko is president, we went home and nothing happened and everything went south from there. And now it won't happen because we won't let it happen again. So now we will make sure that something is changing in Ukraine. That was quite this feeling many people who were there had, that they should have pushed more in 2004. And just one question, is 2004 also the point where Ukrainian identity gets more solidified? Because I think in Russia, identity was Russia is the successor of the USSR, and we are the great power in the region, and we will be the main player here. And Ukraine had to start from something because the narratives were really diversified. And do you think that in 2004 there was more drive after 2004 to find a common identity with Ukraine?
Yeah, 2004, the way we treat it in the book, it's a turning point, kind of this critical juncture for both regime and identity dimensions, and both actually in Ukraine and in Russia. So in Ukraine, what we see, this narrative of Ukrainian distinct history, distinct identity, and this history of Russia trying to crush attempts at Ukrainian political sovereignty, obviously is embraced by Yushchenko, and he tries to legislate various measures, not all of them successfully. So, for example, his attempt to kind of re-narrate the assessment of Ukrainian nationalists of the Second World War period as fighters for Ukrainian independence fails legislatively. But there is sort of gradual shift of, part of the population begins to depart from the Russian narrative that these people were nothing but traitors to the Soviet state, right? So we see kind of, especially if you look at the polling, say from central Ukraine, there is now a substantial part of the population that is like unsure, right? So this before they were against this, like now they're unsure. And on other dimensions, say like on the famine, by the end of the Yushchenko period, majority of the population actually said, yes, we agree that that was that genocide of the Ukrainian people, and that law to that extent also gets passed during Yushchenko tenure. Well, it's important to note that in Russia, that it's also a critical juncture, because this is also the time when this concept of Ruski Mir gets developed in the late 2000s in Putin's Russia. And this notion of Ruski Mir essentially denies kind of the legitimacy and historicity of distinct Ukrainian nation, because it is supposed to be part of this Ruski Mir, right? So we have sort of, again, in this escalatory cycle manner, kind of the process as Ukraine is pulling away, there is greater pressure put by Russia, but as that pressure is applied, sort of there is more pull away from Ukraine. And in Russia, it's also important to note, because sometimes people think that they're really upset only about, say, Bandera. Like, it is much, much bigger set of grievances. For example, at that time period, Russia really resents the fact that Yushchenko, for example, issued commemorative medals about the Battle of Konotop from like 1659, right? And that they are trying to build a monument to Mazepa from 1709, right? And when Lavrov was asked in 2008, like, what are the biggest problems in Ukrainian-Russian relations? It's not NATO. You know, Yushchenko, of course, also wants Ukraine to join Euro-Atlantic structure. It's not NATO. It's not the gas wars. It is language and history. So this sort of kind of growing re-imperialization in Russia at that time period also takes place. And the regime, of course, is another divergence, as Maria was talking about.
Maybe can you give us an idea how things were back in the 90s? Had history already then an important meaning for Russia? Was it already then part of common sense in society that Ukraine actually was always part of a Russian empire, or did those ideas actually become only kind of mainstream ideas when the ideas of Ruski Mir became popular under the Putin administration?
Oh, it definitely goes back to the 90s. It's not, you know, we can say it intensifies, because, for example, in the 1990s, there were debates within Russia of how to define the Russian nation. Like, what is really Russia? What is true Russia, right? Soviet Union collapses, Russia ends up with these borders that are kind of, you know, unprecedented in some sense. But, there is very vibrant debate within Russia how to define the Russian nation. Should it be defined by language, as in like Ruskoязычный, Russian-speaking population? Should it be some sort of Eastern Slavic nation? Should it really, Soviet Union was the true Russia, as Putin now says? And in fact, kind of restorative project, you know, that's what it requires. But there was also a set of ideas that said that basically Russia should define its nation as a multinational nation by the borders of the existing state. This concept of Российская нация, right? Like the two words in Russian to say Russian, Ruski, and Российский was more this kind of civic notion that we are a nation, you know, with and also democratic nation, kind of democracy when part of this civic project. And we go into the book, in our book, for a variety of reasons why the project essentially fails. So the substantial part of Russian political class, certainly like the nationalists, the communists, and some part of Yeltsin elite as well, who were very upset about the collapse of the USSR. Yes, they wanted democracy, they wanted to unseat Gorbachev, but they didn't want Soviet Union to collapse. So already in the 1990s, as Ukrainians are beginning, for example, to teach history from Hrushevsky textbooks, the different presentation of historical narrative, there is a lot of complaint from that. They try to create, for example, a common historical commission of Russian Ukrainian historians that would try to have some kind of common history for the two countries, like there is resistance to that in Ukraine. So to your question, that Ruski Mir is kind of another step in that cycle. But the grievance that Russia had against Ukrainian attempts to narrate history differently, other than some kind of organic unity, goes back to a much earlier period.
Okay. Can we a little bit switch the gears and switch to politics? Maybe with Maidan, this conflict between Russia and Ukraine came to the minds in the West, and we have the narrative or the explanation for the conflict with geopolitics. It's about territory. It's about Crimea, maybe. Yeah. What do you guys think about that? Is this conflict about territory?
We actually do address this in the book where we basically it's the short answer is no, it's not really about territory, and it's not about geopolitics either, because we emphasize that really the until the invasion initially in 2014, there is no majority within Ukraine supporting NATO accession. It's the Russian invasion that becomes another turning point in the divergence between the two nations and adds the geopolitical divergence. And it's only after 2013-14 that a majority of Ukrainians commit to the idea that they will have to join NATO if they're going to survive as an independent state and if they're going to survive the Russian onslaught. We also have an argument, and maybe Oksana can go in further detail, but one that emphasizes that the opening up of the front in eastern Donbass through the interference of Russia there after the annexation of Crimea is really an example of Russia's attempt to actually control the whole Ukrainian state. That this interference was not really about Donbass, but about controlling Kyiv.
Yeah, we do, just maybe to elaborate on that a little bit. So we do argue in the book that the conflict in Donbass kind of paradoxically was not really about Donbass, but it was a plan Russia had to control central Ukrainian government and essentially prevent this kind of growing divergence in Ukraine parting ways with this new pro-Western government that comes to power after Euromaidan. And sort of broadly speaking, the plan was, and again, there is ample evidence both from leaked tapes of Glaziev, so-called Glaziev tapes, and also then interviews the diplomats who were involved, Western diplomats who were involved in the Minsk peace process negotiation, since then acknowledged that what really Russia cared about were not so much like the rights of Russian-speaking population there or any specific arrangement for, say, how local police would be organized, but what they really cared about was the so-called special status for these regions and Ukrainian constitutional change to reflect the special status in the Ukrainian constitution. So in the Donbass, in the Minsk agreement itself, the special status kind of specifics are not defined, but it does say that the special status has to be agreed with the representatives of these proxy regions. And essentially it was about veto power for over central Ukrainian government. So the special status, as Russia wanted it, would be such that even if the pro-Western government is in Kyiv, these regions that are not just pro-Russian but Russia-controlled, essentially these proxy republics, and originally they wanted this whole Novorossiya, so not just Kramp, Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but the original plan was that there would be these people's republics declared across entire southeast of Ukraine. And then they would agree to join in some sort of federal, as that was the argument, that Ukraine needs to federalize, quote unquote. But what it really meant, that these proxy regions, either as one entity in Novorossiya or independently, as in the case of Ramp, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, would essentially have control over veto power over decisions of central Ukrainian government in both domestic and foreign policy. So for that way, right, like, no matter which part of territory you may control, if that's all you control, you don't control central Ukrainian government. But if you have this constitutional change onto Ukraine, and I think we see this parallel now, because this whole talk of denazification, when Putin says they haven't achieved their results until they achieve denazification, like, what is denazification? It's essentially to ensure that in Kyiv, the government cannot pursue any kind of policy that Russia doesn't like. And whatever they try to pursue it, you call it a form of Nazism. So that's essentially what it remains to this day. Control of central government is what's at stake. And it has been between 2014 and 2022. And of course, once Minsk peace process fails, that's sort of the way Putin reasons it, that the attempts to establish control of a central Ukrainian government without intervention fail, full-scale invasion. And that's when they go for the full-scale invasion with the failure of Minsk.
Yeah, I'll just add here that one of the pieces of evidence about why this is not about territory is that Russia controlled the DNR and LNR for all these 8 years. If they wanted that territory, they could have annexed it right then. They could have annexed it way before 22, right? But they obviously chose not to do that. And why? Because, as Oksana already mentioned, if you annex it, then it's yours, and it can no longer be a Trojan horse for controlling the central Ukrainian government.
So, first of all, the things that happened in all those, also in Donbass and in Malorossiya and so on, and Odessa. So it actually showed that Ukrainian society was not inclined to go with Russia in most of those regions. So it only succeeded in Donbass and in Luhansk, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And would you say that now Russia has also as minimal goal to establish something like Minsk III, where it can impose some regions into the Ukrainian state in order to gain this veto power? And is that something that many of those who are arguing for something like Minsk III, like for a frozen conflict, like for plebiscites in those regions, to integrate them with an autonomy status into Ukraine again, for me, it's just a willful ignoring of what happened after 2014. And they are arguing like, yes, and then they can join EU or NATO, but actually it won't happen anytime if Russia gets his way there. So would you think that there is any way to solve this conundrum for Ukraine without massive military power?
I'll maybe start just on the 2014, just to clarify there. I don't think I would say that it's sort of the people in these parts wanted this, because if we actually look at the popular opinions at the time, like there was certainly dissatisfaction with the outcome of Euromaidan. Euromaidan had regional base of support. There was a lot of kind of anxiety and unhappiness about the way the events turned out in the southeastern regions. But it doesn't mean that they wanted some sort of separation from Ukraine or joining with Russia or any of these things. And the opinion polls show that, like, you know, the size of the protests show that. So in a way that Russia, when it succeeds in Donbass, it is more that this project that they had, that essentially using local dissatisfaction to then leverage these declarations, you know, so-called proclamation of these republics that would declare no confidence in central Ukrainian government, like that only succeeds in parts of eastern Donbass, and again with very active involvement of Russia. So that's not to say that there was no popular kind of opposition to the Euromaidan events, but I wouldn't say that it's the outcome of kind of popular preferences, with exactly what we had there. And to your second question, Maria, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean the Minsk III would obviously have the exact same goals as Minsk I and II, to paralyze the central Ukrainian government. So it would absolutely not solve anything. It would continue the same kind of standoff and paralysis that characterized the earlier Minsk agreements for 8 years. But also, it seems to me that we don't even have a clear sign from Putin that he is at this point even willing to consider a Minsk III. I think at this point, the insistence on denazification just really signifies that the lesson that he has drawn from Minsk I and II is that this Trojan horse scenario is not going to work. There has to be full control of the central Ukrainian government.
The annexation of those regions points into this direction. So
yeah, that it's not going to work through regions. It will have to somehow, I think in his calculation, the war has to end for him with Russian control of the government in Kyiv. Not indirect one, but direct one. How does he? And that's why I think it's absolutely, you know, magical thinking to think that at this point it's possible to negotiate something other than Ukraine's de facto capitulation.
I mean, I think we wrote yesterday about it. One solution would be the moment Ukraine signs a peace treaty, it's also automatically a member of the European Union and NATO. And I mean, that's something like a pipe dream, to be sure, but that would be the only solution for Ukraine right now to get out of the Russian, or get some security from Russian aggression right now.
Can I jump in? You remember last week or this week, the Carlson Tucker interview? I think it was around 5 days ago or something. At the end, Putin said to the other side, I think to the US, to Biden, you guys have to find a face-saving solution or something. Yeah, be creative. I think it's clear you lost. Yeah. And if it's not Minsk 3, what does he offers? The 4 regions he asked for goes to Russia, and the rest can stay formally independent but controlled by puppet, right? Puppet regime.
I think that's what he's getting at, because, as he's saying, the goals of the so-called special military operation are not achieved unless denazification happens. Like, what exactly is denazification? Denazification is the kind of government in Kiev that does what Russia wants,
Regime
right?
change.
Like, it is a regime change, right? I don't know if they have any particular politician in mind at this point. It's pretty difficult because there are no sort of openly pro-Russian politicians that have any chance of any kind of being elected in Russia, right? And maybe that's what he says, that the West, again, seeing Ukraine as not a real nation, to him, I think he does believe that somehow US controls Ukraine, right? Like, and in other words, that Biden or NATO or whoever else in the West can some sort of like, remove Zelensky and put some other person in. And that would be the face saving, right? So I think it's sort of double, I don't know what you want to call it, like utopia sounds like a nice way, too nice way of looking at it. That this imperial lens, I think, obscures complete acknowledgement of any Ukrainian agency. They expected Russian troops to be met by grateful Ukrainians, all of this, because I think they believe their own propaganda about Ukraine. And now I think he would probably like to see, again, we don't know how that he exactly envisions it, but that would be that the West needs to find some face-saving way to install essentially pro-Russian government in Kiev. Because as long as the government in Kiev remains sovereign and fully independent and continues to do things that Russia does, Russia doesn't like, that the goals of the special military operation are not achieved, no matter how much additional territory they capture.
He said one.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that this end there is just pure bravado, because I don't even understand how does it follow that the West has lost and it's the West that needs to be finding face-saving measures, given that, as he already said, he hasn't achieved his goals. And he hasn't taken any additional territory in the last year. And in fact, Ukraine has pushed him out of half of the territory that he took initially in 22. So it just seems completely disconnected from reality to be saying you need to be finding face-saving measures when neither Ukraine nor the West have lost.
Yeah, maybe one, to come back to this imperial theme and to the imperial ideology of Russia. At one point, he said something remarkable. It was just one sentence, but it was after he was ranting about that Poland is actually to blame for the German attack in World War II, and that they had to have this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then he said, after they invaded Poland, he had this Das Russia, which was then named USSR, regained its historical lands. And I find that very, very interesting, because he was referring to Western Ukraine. And actually, Western Ukraine is the only part that never was Russia since the Kievan Rus. So it's kind of interesting how he put this, and it stuck to my head. There was so much bullshit around this one sentence, but this one sentence, that's Russia, that was USSR, that was Russia. So it's kind of showing where his ambitions really lie and where they really go. And one really highly contested point is, how much do they believe this imperial ideology and how much they don't believe this imperial ideology, because in my opinion, it also predetermines or is very important where they want to go after this war. So is it like some say, okay, they get Ukraine and they're happy, but of course, I know you two think that he won't be happy after Ukraine, so they won't go for more if they are able to and if they are allowed to. Would you agree to this?
Are you talking about the elites or the public, or both?
Both.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know, I would say this. So first of all, this, you know, if you look at the public opinion, that obviously any kind of public polling in an authoritarian setting has its problems. At the same time, we do know that this notion of, you know, Ukraine and Russia as being really one, and Slavic unity and all of this, it does resonate with a lot of, and has always resonated with a lot of part of both elites and the public. And in a way, like whether people sort of genuinely believe it, or for example, they would not admit to believing something else in the polls, almost kind of doesn't really matter, because the regime is so authoritarian and environment is permissive. Nobody's saying like, let's not be imperialist. So in other words, if say Putin decided, maybe not immediately, let's say they you know, were to capture more of Ukraine, would they go into like Estonia, Moldova, and so forth? I mean, they may not go immediately just because they don't have the capacity, probably, right? But if they do decide to do this, and exactly as you said, his point that, you know, Russian historical land is sort of unclear where it ends, and certainly you could make a case that parts of Moldova and Poland and Estonia and so forth is Russian historical land. I mean, that wouldn't be very difficult to make that spin, right? There may not be particularly any opposition to it. So in a way, it's sort of a lot of moving parts. Would there be permissive environment domestically? Would there be permissive environment internationally? And I think the West showing, you know, Putin certainly interprets, we do talk about it in the book, that the West is kind of weak and divided and is not going to respond. And then if, say, now again, we see this all this mayhem in U.S. Congress, and I think he's drawing lessons from it, that the West is indeed not committed to supporting Ukraine, that he can play on these divisions, and then he can take it sort of as far as he allowed to take it.
So might it be actually that he thinks that NATO wouldn't actually stick to Article 5 if Russia was trying to maybe stage some incidents in Estonia or somewhere else? So I think that's one main point where this weakness, this perceived weakness of the West right now might lead to that he has formed the opinion that NATO won't act in defense of some of its member states if push comes to shove. Would you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the longer NATO hesitates on coming up with an actual roadmap for Ukraine to join NATO, the more it makes the point, kind of implicitly, that Ukraine cannot enter NATO because NATO does not want to fight Russia. But if NATO sends this message that it doesn't want to fight Russia, obviously it erodes the credibility of Article 5 as it pertains to the NATO members that Russia has ambitions over. And on the question of whether they believe it, I think the sort of the strongest argument against taking these statements about who they're going to go after next, the strongest argument is to say, look, they're just inflating their narrative because they want to be given, they're asking really high because they want to be given Ukraine, and that's why they're threatening, so that afterwards, when you give them only Ukraine, you, the West, will feel like, oh, well, at least we didn't give them also the Baltics and also Poland. So it'll feel like a compromise. So I can see that argument. But on the other hand, I think they're also showing steps, concrete actions that show that their designs on the Baltics, at least, are very real. Because if it's only rhetoric, then why are they just now opening a wanted case to prosecute criminally the prime minister of Estonia for doing things in Estonia pertaining only to Estonia? like the removal of the monuments, which are Estonian property, right? So obviously that's a concrete action, a step that shows that they're serious about it. They would like to be able to arrest the Prime Minister of Estonia.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit about the Western side. So you already said it. It's like this fear of confronting Russia head on. So it's like that's something Russia learned in Crimea, then in Donbass after MH17 was shot down, and everything was clear cut that it was a Russian. The Russians are operating in Donbass and they are controlling Donbass, and where the West has to decide where to confront Russia at some point, because and one of the main fears some of those who advocate of not confronting Russia is the fear for nuclear weapons. But I think that's a problem that's not solvable, because if Russia learns that it just has to wave around those nuclear weapons and the threat is somehow real, so we don't know if they use them at some point. I mean, it's not rationally, but we already know that it's not everything that Putin and Russia does is quite rational. Isn't it a problem? Where do you start to really fight back? And I think you don't get rid of this problem with nuclear weapons. Putin already showed a willingness to use this threat and to use it to his political gains, and that's something that's new in political engagement, I think.
Yeah, I think the fear of nuclear escalation in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion was not unreasonable, because indeed Putin came out with these seriously worded threats, and obviously it's so catastrophic that you have to, at least in the beginning, take it seriously, and that prompted the whole escalation management strategy, which I think in the beginning of 22 was probably a reasonable strategy to try to minimize the likelihood of catastrophic escalation. The question is, at what point do we recognize and take the update and decide that escalation management is no longer necessary? And I think we have ample evidence over the last now almost 2 years that Putin that this was bravado in the and just scare tactics in the early phase of the war, because when the different sort of supposed red lines by Russia were crossed one by one, more and better weapons were delivered to Ukraine. Ukraine retook territory. Ukraine attacked Crimea. All of these red lines have been crossed, and he has responded rationally to all of these red lines. Basically, to the point where now it's hard to see why we saw Crimea as so special and so different from the rest of the occupied territory, when in fact the Ukrainians have now called this bluff and bombed different targets in Crimea several times, and Russia hasn't responded in any meaningful way. So I think at this point, unless we have some sort of new and clear message that that he is willing to escalate in a nuclear way, something serious rather than this latest, he's going to put nuclear weapons in space kind of thing. I think we have to reassess the escalation management.
And speaking of fears, the West has the second, I think the second great fear is twofold. First, what happens after Putin? So that's something I have the impression that a lot of policymakers in the West are really trying to not destabilize the Putin regime because they are really afraid of what comes after. And I think if you spin this thread further, the main fear is the disintegration of Russia in some way, even though it's not really a thing that will happen in the future. But I think that that's something that's driving policies towards Ukraine and towards Russia in Western thinking.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention a couple of things here because, first of all, this, if we can say, okay, some bad things can happen if Russia were to disintegrate. We also have to balance it with assessment, and I think here we don't know if Russia will disintegrate. We'll get to that, but we do know. I mean, at least we can be more certain about what kind of things would happen if Russia is allowed to keep pushing in Ukraine and achieve its objectives and threaten Europe and threaten other countries and all of these, like, embolden autocrats elsewhere. So there is clear cost of like not stopping Russia, right? So that kind of has to be balanced with hypotheticals of what happens if Russia disintegrates. Now, the whole disintegration, I mean, first of all, nobody is talking about the defeat of Russia. It doesn't mean that Ukrainian army marches to Moscow, right? So defeat of Russia and sort of the way Ukrainians define victory is regaining control of their internationally recognized territory. Russia has its internationally recognized territory. So the idea that if Russian forces had to withdraw to Russian recognized territory, it's not some sort of defeat and change of the regime and all of these things. So potentially we could say Putin's propaganda is very strong. Like as Maria was saying, oftentimes all sorts of red lines were crossed, and yet neither nuclear response nor disintegration followed in Russia. So that's sort of a second thing to keep in mind, that the defeat of Russia is actually not like the kind of defeat that, say, Germany had in the Second World War or Japan and so forth. And finally, I think this reasoning that, well, Soviet Union collapsed when Gorbachev weakened, therefore Russia has to collapse. I think these are in many ways kind of false analogies. I mean, many things were different. That, say, in the case of the Soviet Union, there was a period of political openness. There were elections held. These legislatures in the Union republics, achieved certain, there was sort of institutional way, and there is a reason why it collapsed along certain borders and not others. So I think this prediction that Russia would collapse, I'm very skeptical about it, especially when parallels are drawn with the late Soviet period. I think the circumstances are really quite different. The extent of control has been much stronger. And so that would be kind of the sort of thing that I would say that the whole narrative of inevitable disintegration, I'm not convinced that it's very credible.
But
I'll also add, sorry, I also wanted to add to this that the fear of Russian disintegration strikes me as really kind of strange, because on the one hand, as Oksana said, and I agree, it seems quite far-fetched. But secondly, I don't think we can necessarily assume that it's going to be a net negative, even for Russia itself, in the sense that I don't think we can safely assume that it will necessarily lead to any civil war. I don't think we can necessarily assume that there will be warlords that are taking over loose nuclear weapons. I mean, this is some kind of nightmarish scenario, which maybe is possible, but it seems to me that it is also possible for it to disintegrate, if it ever does, in a way that's negotiated, that's partial, that lets only a few parts of it go that are particularly motivated, and it might end in Russia's democratization. I mean, I don't know why we're necessarily assuming that it's going to be a fully nightmarish scenario.
I think it's the argumentation of those who are for a fast peace treaty or a fast frozen conflict, because it's this horror scenario. But I mean, it's like the US also was quite afraid of the collapse of the USSR. So we have this famous Kiev speech, and Brad Zubok in his book Collapse argues that the United States was actually quite surprised when it really happened. And another thing, we were talking about red lines. So I have to bring it up. It's the death of Navalny. So my first reaction was, it's kind of a red line. He actually killed, I think it's safe to say that the regime did want to kill him or murder him. Killed the most popular oppositional leader in Russia, even though he was incarcerated for some time and tortured for some time. But I was still surprised because I thought it's some bargaining chip against the West. And for me, it was a sign that he has finally skipped the notion of still being somehow a negotiating partner for the West. So it was a sign for the West, and of course it was a sign for his own opposition. But actually, I think Russian oppositionals know that they're dangerous, or they're living in great danger all the time. So I don't think this argument it's a sign for the opposition in Russia. It's just not feasible because everyone knows what the consequences of opposition in Russia are right now.
Martin, talking about Navalny, Mark Galeotti said yesterday it's a sign of weakness. And more analysts say this argument. They use this argument that a powerful dictator doesn't need to kill his opponents. What do you guys think? Is it a sign of weakness?
I don't think so. I think a powerful dictator doesn't need to kill opponents, but he may still want to. And we know that Putin despises Navalny for surviving the poisoning attempt. He has had people murdered who are less powerful or less consequential than Navalny. So I don't think we should always assume that these murders are committed out of necessity. I mean, I see where Mark Galeotti is coming from. I mean, I think that's what Navalny himself would have wanted to believe. That's what he says, right, in the documentary, that if I'm murdered, it's because we were really strong. But I actually don't really buy it. I don't see if that's the kind of the assumption, or if that's the hypothesis. It seems that we should have seen some sort of evidence of that strength in recent times, in the run up to this happening, which
you mean evidence of weakness of the regime? Yeah.
Evidence of strength of Navalny's organization.
Oh, of Navalny, right?
Evidence of strength. Yeah. Evidence that he's making a difference and having an impact on something, right? And I don't really see it. I mean, if anything, it seems that it made much more sense to then kill him in 2022 when the invasion happened and when there were some protests and when he did say that he is against the war. Why not kill him there? It seems that he was stronger as a threat than a month ago, right? When he was all the way in Siberia and incommunicado. Where is the strength that needs to be countered?
No, I fully agree. I think, but this point that Maria made already, that this notion that these dictators act in sort of with minimum violence necessary to maintain power or something like that, I don't think, we see that happening in the Putin case, because one could even sort of go back to mid, 2000s and say, like, did they need to engage in all sorts of repression? When Putin was the most popular politician, he could probably win clean elections with 60% support, right? Like, why do you need 78% support when you can win with like 65% support, right? So all of these, so I think if it's anything, it's a sign of impunity, because he not only he basically can, yes, maybe he doesn't need to for some kind of power maximizing calculus to do it, but he can, and he hates Navalny, and here is he's doing it, and what's going to happen, right? He's pretty sure that there are going to be no popular protest to threaten him, that there won't be any kind of, Western reaction. So I think this notion that he calculates, right? If he was calculating, he probably wouldn't be invading Ukraine because, for example, they had a lot of levers over influence of Ukraine, even after Euromaidan, right? They had various Russia-friendly populations and elites and media and the oligarchs, and all of this basically was thrown into the wind because there are some other calculus as opposed to this sort of purely rational, I do the minimum necessary to maintain power. So yeah, so I agree with Maria. I don't think it's a sign of regime weakness at all.
Okay, I add a second question, then we can go on to wrap the thing up. Sam Green, another colleague, tweeted today or yesterday, Navalny believed and his closest allies still believe that the route to Russia's democratic future must run through Ukraine. Their moral clarity on this is striking. For democracy to have a chance, Russian imperialism must face an incrementably military defeat. Do you think Sam Green is correctly reflecting Team Navalny's position here? Because I wondered when I wrote this.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think it's hard to exactly pinpoint where they stood on this because I think they made some slightly not contradictory, but sort of they omitted some. They wanted to be against the war without emphasizing the imperialist nature of it, and I think I'm not really prepared to comment on exactly what Navalny or his team thought about it, but it seems to me that that was a recognition on their part of the fact that Russian society is not ready to be given an anti-imperialist narrative, to be shamed into its imperialism. So they wanted to emphasize democracy. That's why Navalny was emphasizing, switch to parliamentary system. It seems to me that that was the thrust of his emphasis the last 2 years. If I become president, I will switch to a parliamentary system. I think he wanted to emphasize domestic democracy because he realized the limitation, if he wanted to be a national politician, the limitation of a purely anti-imperialist sort of agenda. So, yeah, so I don't think they necessarily were super clear on it, even if they may have believed this, privately, so to speak.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree. I don't know if that's, as Maria said, we can't really know for sure how Team Navalny thinks on this, but what Sam Green said as kind of a statement of fact, I think that's accurate, because if any sort of hope for democratization in Russia has to come through, Russian defeat in this war against Ukraine. So in that sense, helping Ukraine win gives the best hope for those who want to bring change in Russia as well, because there isn't going to be some sort of regime change because of popular protests in Russia or like elite division without defeat on the battlefield in Ukraine. So in that sense, that's a strategic kind of, if you are, say, if all you care about is change in Russia, and even if you don't care about Ukraine, so that much either way, that's still strategically sound choice to say, okay, supporting Ukraine in this war is actually the best chance for democratization in Russia. But then just to emphasize, with Maria's point, that sort of to the extent Team Navalny is anti-imperialist, or Navalny himself would have been had he, for example, became president, I think that's more of an open question mark. So in other words, this process of sort of de-imperialization of Russia and democratization, they are, they could be mutually reinforcing, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily would occur together. So in other words, you can sort of see some change in the regime, potentially political openness, and still very strong imperialist narratives, or you can see that changing as well. So that's, I would add this to the conversation.
Thank you. Maybe we come to a close, and I want to go back to your beautiful book. I mean, beautiful is maybe the wrong word for it, but it's a very insightful book. As you're following the history of both countries and the developments in both countries, to to the point when the invasion started. So where do you think the point of no return was overstepped in these developments? Where was for you the point where you actually think that the invasion was quite a logical consequence?
That's a very good question. I mean, in some way, I think there really wasn't a point of no return, in the sense that Putin could have chosen to not invade and to continue trying other levers of influence in a much more rational kind of way. But the success over time of the post-Maidan reforms probably was pushing him sort of against the wall more and more, in realizing that different levers of influence are weakening, maybe becoming blocked. I mean, the fact that he talked in the pre-invasion speech about the details of the High Council of Justice in Ukraine shows that, you know, he was following these reforms, and saw the regime divergence, especially as a threat. But I think he still could have chosen not to invade.
Yep, I agree. We actually, in the days and weeks leading before the invasion, we've been commenting, right, how that's such a crazy decision, given that, there were still levers of influence. I mean, that was ultimately, a point of no return was reached when Putin decided to send troops across the border, right? This divergence was making it harder and harder for him to achieve the goal of controlling Ukraine without essentially overthrowing the central government. But still the decision to invade was his, and was not predetermined in that sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, the point where I got really anxious or fearful of what will happen was when he made his proposal to NATO and to the West. That was, for me as historian, it was like the diplomatic protest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Serbia. So I read these points and it was completely clear that it would never be accepted. So it was like this, okay, we are feigning some kind of compromise and we know they will never accept it. And then we have our casus belli, for example. But that combined with the troop, with the what do you say, with the masses of troops that were concentrated on the Ukrainian front of the border, there were some warning signs. But of course, as with World War One, if Kaiser Franz Joseph would have decided not to invade Serbia, maybe nothing would have happened. That's the main point.
With this NATO, I mean, we talk, in the book about it. It's not that, Putin liked the fact that Ukraine wanted to join NATO, but that was just one of the grievances that he had against Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So by itself, Ukraine that was, say, not a member of NATO, which it hasn't been, and it's not, looks like it's not going to join anytime soon, was just not sufficient. Given the sorts of claims and grievances against all sorts of hosts of Ukrainian domestic politics, this divergence that you talk about in the book, it wouldn't have reversed that, right? So in that sense, it's not to say that the NATO part of the story doesn't have any role to play, but it is important, I think, to emphasize that, first of all, Ukraine becomes more committed to join NATO after, like, as a much later stage, after this divergence in these other areas takes place, and the divergence that Russia very much dislikes and tries to push against. And then for Russia, also the extent of grievances that they had against what the Ukrainian government was doing without consent, or like against the interests of Russia as they define it, also went much further than Ukrainian geopolitical alliance or hopes for alliance.
So
actually, consent for joining NATO was quite low in 2014 before the invasion of Crimea and Donbass happened. So that's one last point. We actually never mentioned the title of your book. So it's called Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, and it's really, really a great read. So it was my favorite, one of my favorites in 2023. So I was really looking forward and can highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Maria, Oksana, thank you for coming. To our audience, you can buy the book. You can read it online or in English right now. It's not translated in German, Martin, right?
No, it's not. But do you know?
There might be a translation. We
There
had
might
interest
be. We're
from
working on it.
It would be really important. So a lot of people need to read this book because it's really a good summary and a very good insight.
Yeah, Martin is someone who you can trust. Okay, thank you.
Excellent, because they actually said that they would not need to somebody who is obviously fluent in German and in English. We don't speak German, either of us, to read the translated text to make sure it's correct for accuracy. We'll put you together with Andreas Umland. He's kind of presiding over the translation project.
Okay, he knows what to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Good talking
Thanks
to
for
you.
inviting us.